name is Nancy Virtue, and I teach French and International Studies at IPFW. And one of the many things that I love about being a college professor is that it gives me a lot of freedom to pursue questions that I find interesting. And I think I have kind of a somewhat unique research background in the sense that I have fairly dramatically shifted my research interest since I first began as a graduate student and as an untenured professor at IPFW. My initial research interests lay in the area of early modern French literature. And more particularly, I looked at, as a graduate student, I did my dissertation on the representation of rape in the Renaissance novella, primarily in the Renaissance novella, a little bit in the Middle Ages as well. So my main research direction was in the area of medieval Renaissance studies and in literary studies in particular. Then I shifted, and that shift was pretty dramatic, but it was driven by a number of sort of things that were happening in my professional life at that time, sort of around 2000, 2001. The first one was that I got tenure. And so when you get tenure, you have a little bit of leeway to sort of, open up and look around and see, are there other areas that I might want to pursue? I also, right around that same time, took a trip to North Africa. I also became co-director of international studies and started teaching international studies courses at IPFW. And finally, within our French program, we had done a pretty extensive French review of the French courses in consultation with the students at the time. So what I was finding as international studies co-director and within the French program is that there was a need to develop courses on topics of somewhat more contemporary subject matter. And because I've always loved cinema and I was becoming more and more interested in the relationship between France and Algeria, I thought that this might be a direction that would be useful for our students as well, both in international studies and in French. So it served a number of purposes, and it was something I was very interested in, finding myself being very interested in. So now, my main focus of research is on French cinema's representation of the French-Algerian War. The French-Algerian War was Algeria's war for independence. Algeria, for about a century before the war began, had been occupied by colonial France. So they were fighting for their independence. It took place between 1954 and 1962. So what I do is I look at primarily French films that either depict that war overtly or that represent stories or tell stories of that time period without necessarily talking that much about the Algerian War. This happened to also be a time of very severe censorship. The French government did not want a lot of criticism of their occupation of Algeria, and they didn't want a lot of criticism of the war. So they strictly censored any films or novels or journalistic writing that was too harshly critical. So what you have is a number of films that were made at that time that couldn't really talk about the war, but that end up sort of addressing it kind of covertly. One of the things I look at, for example, is allegorical treatments of the war. So allegories tend to look at personal stories about people and their personal lives and read into them. Is there something that we can learn from these personal stories that might reflect what's happening on a cultural or larger political level? So that's part of what I'm doing. It was also very much in the air in the 1950s and 60s. Jean-Luc Godard, a very important new wave director, was famous for saying, it's important not just to make political films, but to make films politically. So these films very much are in line with that way of thinking, that you don't necessarily have to overtly criticize the French-Algerian War. You can still comment on it and avoid censorship without directly addressing it. So those are the types of questions I look at. I think they're not as far apart in approach than they might initially seem, because I'm still looking at artistic texts, either cinematic, in this case cinematic, but in the past literary, that in the context of cultural, social, and political factors. So, so in some ways you could say I've just slightly shifted in time period and subject matter, but the approach is still one that is similar. I just completed a sabbatical, and I worked on 2 articles, one of which is related to this project, and that article was on Gillo Pontecorvo's film, The Battle of Algiers. What I hope to do, so mainly I've just been sort of publishing articles in this area, but I'm also sort of working gently toward a manuscript, which would be just about allegorical approaches to the French-Algerian War. So that's ultimately what I'm working toward right now. I've got just a number of articles that I'm hoping to sort of bring into a book manuscript. So.